Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. I'm joined today by Jonathan Reckford, CEO of Habitat for Humanity International, a global Christian housing organization that has helped more than 62 million people build, rehabilitate, or preserve their homes. That's right, 62 million. Over the last 20 years, under Jonathan's leadership, Habitat has expanded from serving about 125,000 individuals annually to reaching more than 3 million people last year, helping families build strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. During his tenure, Habitat has expanded its impact across all 50 states in more than 70 countries around the world. Jonathan brings to Habitat a unique blend of private sector experience and mission-driven leadership, with early roles at Goldman Sachs, Marriott, the Walt Disney Company, and Best Buy. Welcome, Jonathan. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
So I did not realize, but if I have a problem with my iPhone, I should call you first?
That would be a big mistake.
Okay.
There was a time where I knew all about consumer electronics.
This is a lot of fun. We've spent a lot of time together. We work together on legislation, on policy agendas, but I've also been out in the field with a hammer at a Habitat site. It is an incredible experience. I know that there are very well-intentioned and people like me who are hammering away, and some very competent people who come in behind us and pull those nails out and put them in the right way. But it is an incredible way to connect with this powerful experience of helping a family become a homeowner. And that's like the heart and soul, I think, of what you all do, although you do a lot more than just that. Habitat is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and it's kind of incredible. It spans longer than my entire career in housing, and it's kind of always been there. It's always been a part of the housing ecosystem. Tell me a little bit about how you are looking at this 50th anniversary in terms of both looking back and also looking forward.
So we are excited to have our 50th anniversary, and we've set a bold goal for 50, which is we've called it 50 for 50, helping 50 million people over the next 3 years have new or approved or access to shelter. And that's 3 million where we are directly working alongside the families in our traditional community work around the world, 14 million through market development, where we're actually helping change markets and systems that allow families to improve their own housing. And housing microfinance has been a huge piece of that. 30 million through advocacy and policy change, a place where you and I have worked so closely together on the U.S. side, but trying to create the enabling environment to allow more housing to be created. And then 3 million directly volunteers engaged with our work. And there are a couple of things that might surprise people about Habitat. One was we changed our framing question from how many houses can we build, which was a really good question, to what would it take to actually achieve our vision of a world where everyone has a decent place to live. And that really required us to start thinking about markets and systems. The other was moving our volunteers from primarily thinking of them as a construction strategy, though we have great admiration for you coming out and bringing your muscles and banging nails, to really thinking of that as an engagement strategy. So if you think about it, we want to engage volunteers, not first because that's the most efficient way to build homes, but because if we get people out in the communities working together and understanding the issues, we hope they will help us change the enabling environment, be the yes in my backyard kind of folks that will then help create the environment for more housing. Then the markets will start actually working better for low and moderate income families. Then Habitat and other housers can build more housing. And that's really the virtuous circle that has allowed us to move from helping thousands to millions. But we certainly know, as I'm sure we'll talk about, that we are not winning around housing affordability here in the US or anywhere in the world right now.
No, and I love the idea of this as an engagement strategy because it's always been an engagement reality. I mean, people are very engaged. They understand your mission as a result of doing this work. They're doing a lot more than just helping build a home. But capitalizing on that, I think, is probably a piece where, it hasn't been fully evolved. And now there's a focus on that. How do you foresee that, kind of coming of age as you take this workforce and turn them into a political force?
And I would say it's a constant learning process. Not everyone who comes out wants to be an advocate, but the first level, I hope, is relationship. And actually, I think that is a good in itself, which is, I would say, that we have all kinds of polarization and divides in our society. The toughest one has become the socioeconomic divide. And we've become a world of people with assets and people without assets. It's another reason housing is so crucial. And and I'm preaching to the choir and maybe preaching to the preachers right now, but we need to do a better job of telling everyone that housing is not just an end in itself, but is also a platform for health, education, livelihoods, all the other goods that we want. And our hope is when people come out and experience the community aspect of being in maybe a part of town they've not spent time in, working alongside folks that they have not spent time with, what we see is that when people work together, they focus on their shared values as opposed to their differences. And maybe that starts to create empathy, creates an openness. We hope that that's rather than an end in itself, an on-ramp to your point. And we're still, I would say, learning community by community the best ways to then translate that into the next step. But one thing we're trying to do is put education into that day. So maybe at lunchtime, there's a conversation around what's going on in the local housing community and in that city or in that town. And here are things people could actually do about that. And trying to plant the seeds in that build experience that then can lead to either support for zoning changes, support for housing bonds, for an openness to thinking about it. And a lot of our most innovative work started in the global South, where markets really didn't work for a huge part of the population. I would argue today in the U.S., the housing market doesn't work for a significant amount of our U.S. population in terms of their ability to purchase or rent something at a reasonable percentage of their income.
Yeah, in a different way than the global economy. It doesn't work, but it definitely has some commonalities. And I think one of the things you mentioned in terms of market development was housing microfinance. And I'm very familiar with micro lending and the Grameen Bank and the way that micro lending and investment has had a transformational impact on communities around the world. What does that mean in this country? Because we're not talking about just a loan to buy a sewing machine in a village, in Africa. It's bigger and different here. And what does that mean in terms of housing?
So we set out, I had been on the board before Habitat of a micro lending network, and it was exactly what you're talking about. So these were making small loans, mostly to women, to start small businesses. And the thesis was you could only lend for businesses because they would generate the income to pay back the loan as well as then create economic value for the family. When I would interview the mostly women in these other countries who were taking out the loans, I would always ask, what are you doing other than reinvesting in your small business? And virtually 100% of the time, they would say, I am fixing up my house and I'm paying my fees for my kids to be able to go to school. Two incredibly good things. And we knew there was a huge need for housing lending. And again, I think now there's some parallels to the US. So we started experimenting and we started lending small amounts of money to microfinance banks in a few countries and training them on how to start a housing portfolio just to test. So we de-risked the testing. What we found was there was a huge unmet need for housing, that in a lot of these countries, only about 5% of the population can get a formal bank loan for housing. The mortgage market is for only the economic elite in most countries. And we found the demand was overwhelming. And in fact, the repayment rates on the home improvement loans, these aren't whole house mortgages. These are small loans that might allow a family to get a cement floor instead of a dirt floor, get water, get a proper roof, get an extra room so the boys and girls could be separated at night, but they could run a little business during the day out of that space. And we found the repayment rates were in the very high 90s, actually higher than the small business loans. And based on that, we launched 12 years ago a fund called Microbuild. And we borrowed $90 million, which was a little scary. And we raised $10 million of equity. And now we've just wound down that fund. And it's really one of the things I'm most proud of. We ended up loaning out 2.3 cycles. So we loaned $230 million to 56 microfinance banks in 33 countries. 12 years later, that directly helped 1.1 million people get upgraded housing. And we did a bunch of studies to show the impact of that. What was really exciting is the demonstration effect. The banks that we then loaned money to and trained saw that this was a viable market, and they put 1.1 billion of their own capital into housing lending. So that 10 million of equity generated 1.4 billion of loan capital, and at $500 to $800 a loan, this is helping millions of people have access to housing finance and be able to improve their housing. And it's the equivalent, if you think in the US, if you wanted to build a home or to improve your home and you had to do it with a credit card with a $500 limit and you had to buy everything at Lowe's. So what families were doing were essentially they'd buy a bag of cement, wait a long time, buy a few bricks, wait a long time, buy a few more bricks, wait a long time. With a small loan, we could help them build that room, get all the value of the room, and then pay it back on low terms. Having paid back the loan, they can then get potentially another loan. And over time, our goal is they get to something that meets all of our needs. So we're now trying to raise a second and larger fund for this initiative. And we've worked with a number of banks outside the fund that have gone from no housing lending to significant housing lending. And that's when we talk about market development, that's probably our best example of we've actually over time started to create a new asset class and where now families could have access to housing finance. Because without that, what we found is banks wouldn't lend to them. And then you're only able to go to money lenders or friends and family. That leaves out an awful lot of folks. I would actually now argue, again, in the US, we've got an awful lot of families who don't have access to a housing loan. And certainly the bigger here issue is just the cost side. But I think it's a great example where how do we make the market in the US work better? And you've been such a great spokesperson on this. We've got to increase supply of housing because we can't solve it without building a lot more housing in this country.
It's all about supply and demand, and they are linked in ways that you really can't peel them apart. What I wanted to do is, before we get into domestic policy, which we've done a lot of work together on, tell me about what you all do overseas, because it's Habitat for Humanity International, and the work that you do outside of the country is pretty expansive. And I think most people don't really understand or know just how much you do and where you do it.
Oh, thank you for that, David. It is interesting. We are blessed with this incredibly strong brand in the U.S., but we just did some research last year in preparation for the 50th. And one of the things we learned is, in a way, there's such a strength to the brand, but people have also locked in that they already know us. And ironically, the things we're best known for turn out not to be true. So what everyone knows about Habitat in the U.S. is that President Carter started and runs Habitat, which is not true, but he certainly put us on the map when he got involved back in 1984.
A very big fan.
And that's 35 years of his building really created our reputation in so many ways. The other thing is people think we give away houses, and actually they're surprised but like it better when they understand the whole model of how we sell houses to families and all the work we do alongside them to prepare them to be homeowners. But the other one surprise is that so much of our work is outside the U.S. And in fact, the great majority of the individuals we help every year are in low and middle income contexts. So we serve in more than 60 countries around the world, a mix, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Europe and the Middle East, with strong programs actually in all those spaces. I already talked a little bit about some of the market development work. So if you think about the housing value chain, in a way, we started doing our traditional work of coming into communities and building alongside and building houses. We started a couple of different strategic shifts. One was moving from whole houses only to whole houses and incremental building, because for a huge percentage of the world, the only way they can build is incrementally. Even if we could give them a whole house mortgage, they couldn't afford the payments. And so we're trying to break that into smaller chunks that allow them incrementally to get to something that meets all our standards over time. So we still do that deep community work. And if you think about the 5 areas of housing, we work on making sure they have the right to stay on their property. So property rights, particularly for women and marginalized groups, has become our biggest global advocacy issue, though our second big campaign has been around upgrading slums and informal settlements. And a lot of those same issues tie to property rights there. And that makes sense because if you don't have the right to stay on your land, it doesn't make sense to invest in upgrading your housing. The next step was housing finance. We already talked about that. And then we moved into building materials and skilled labor. So we've worked with private sector entrepreneurs to come up with better building products, and we did shelter tech accelerators in each region of the world. And then we started working on how do we help people choose a mason? How do you have access to skilled labor? And we've done a number of experiments in that space. And then the last step is consumer education. And how do we help families know how to do that home improvement process? And we've tried all kinds of things. A new and way too early to declare victory, but an interesting experiment we've been doing the last couple of years is home improvement web-based, phone-based television, where in the Philippines, Kenya, and Peru, we're doing essentially entertainment of how to fix up your house. And it's actually a way to reach millions of people relatively cost effectively and start infuse them. If you think actually they're great friends of Habitat, the Property Brothers, but focused on a very different market and a very different approach to building. But so that's all under our Center for Innovation and Shelter. And then our core programming is still around construction, around water and sanitation, and our advocacy work is heavily around creating the enabling environment. I'll give an example. Nepal is a very low-income context, and there we've worked very closely with the government on improving regulations. We've had some big successes getting some historically marginalized groups to have the right to stay on their land. Then we've worked to create a new industry with really certified bamboo, which was considered a throwaway material, but is a renewable, low-cost material if it's properly treated. So we've worked on creating new approaches to using bamboo for construction that have allowed us to do quite low-cost construction, but still highly disaster resilient and environmentally renewable. So example of kind of thinking across the housing value chain to make the systems work for very low-income families to be able to upgrade their housing. And there we work with a network of local microfinance groups that are doing lending to those families to do those upgrades. So that is what good can look like. There's also a lot of disaster response, sadly, because we have between man-made and natural disasters, it feels like every day there's a new place where housing is getting destroyed as opposed to built. And then we're trying to cross-pollinate the lessons from that back into the U.S. And the formative effort for us was, when I first joined, we were responding to the Indian Ocean tsunami in Southeast Asia.
Right.
And that was the first time we really worked on scale, because we had been designed in a way to build a few houses in 1 million locations. And suddenly we needed a lot of houses in a few locations. The learning from that actually started a lot of our international scaling work. In the US, I would say in a similar way, Hurricane Katrina was an inflection point, because suddenly we ended up building 25,000 houses after the tsunami, and we built 6,000 houses on the Gulf Coast after Katrina. We'd never done anything at that level of scale in a concentrated area, and that planted the seeds for the change in a way in the US side as well.
Yeah, catapulting scale can really be a total game changer and a shift in organization in ways that you can't even envision till you're in it. So let's talk about housing policy. We have certainly a massive housing affordability crisis in this country. It is so bad it has become its own opportunity, because we now have political leaders of all parties, of all regions in the country, who know many people, often in their own family, who are struggling with this. And so as a result, we have a unique opportunity for real bipartisan cooperation, which we've started to see. This is not something that is new to Habitat. You've been working on this for a while. We've been working on this and have tried to build the infrastructure for this moment. Tell me about the work that you're doing now in the policy space. And I want to talk about the future in a moment in terms of, the Homeownership Supply Accelerator. But right now, let's focus on the legislation that's in Congress now. So how is Habitat engaging? We have legislation that has been passed in both the House and the Senate with huge bipartisan margins. How do you see us getting over the finish line here?
Thank you, David. Well, first, thank you for your leadership in this space. I do think this is a moment. If we can bring good out of bad, to your exact point, everybody is thinking about housing now, really at every level. And I've never seen a time where, whether it's a mayor, a governor, or a member of Congress, and I ask, what are your top issues? Housing is not number 8 now, it's number 1. And I think people are seeing it both as a moral and economic imperative. We're seeing governors. And I think I want to go to federal, but I don't want to leave out local and state, because so much of housing is we need local, state, and federal action. And local is all about zoning. And we're seeing states now get involved in zoning, and actually conservative states even, because they're seeing, Now my own home state of Georgia, though they haven't gotten there yet, the governor is trying to weaken local zoning rules because he recruited all these clean energy factories to rural Georgia, and they can't hire workers because there's no housing. And these local communities are resisting housing. And so you see whether Texas, Montana, Utah, you're seeing statewide moves to remove some of the 1980s minimum lot size rules or parking minimums, things that can actually speed up and make it faster and easier to build or make the math work better. So we need state, we need local, and Habitat, in a way, a strength for us is we work in almost 1,000 communities across the U.S. So we're in every congressional district, we're in every state, and that's helpful because housing is local. And so we're a local housing organization in all those places. And that's so important at the federal level. As I've been telling a story, we just had our 20th Habitat on the Hill. And so most of our work day to day is trying to get to members of Congress when they're home. But once a year, we rally everyone together. And I think we had almost 500 Habitat leaders, homeowners, and board members together in February. And we met with over 300 members of Congress. And we're seeing real receptivity. And I think that showed up in the numbers you talked about in the House and Senate. And I had a recent conversation. I told it that story. Last year, I was in a wealthy resort area, and the mayor had historically not been supportive of housing. And he gave a full-throated call that we needed to build more of every kind of housing. We needed to speed it up. We needed to build apartments. We needed more opportunities. We need to allocate land. And I asked him, so what changed? This is great. And what changed? And his very honest answer was, I've got to get my kid out of my basement. So, now it was personal. It wasn't those people. It was. And I do think now that middle-class families, children cannot afford housing, that's where it's become a federal political issue, whereas it was already an affordability crisis, but less visible at the federal level. And so we are optimistic. I think, unfortunately, now the House and Senate are tied up on Homeland Security, and that is getting in the way of getting to reconciliation on the housing bills. I think practically the R's on the Senate side and the House side are not fully aligned. That being said, everybody knows we need to do something. When affordability is the number one political issue, housing is the biggest chunk of affordability. And therefore, I'm optimistic they will get somewhere. We won't get everything we want. I don't think either side will get everything they want, but I do think there is pressure to actually do something. And I hope you're optimistic too. I think we will see it move. It's just obviously we should all move faster.
Yeah, I am optimistic. I think that getting everything you want is a perfectly reasonable opening position in a negotiation, but it's not how things get done. And we have a dynamic. I've written about this recently. I think Sam Rayburn has been quoted more in the last few weeks than probably the last 10 years. But the former Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, used to caution his young Democratic members, the Republicans are our opponents, but the Senate is the enemy. And that feeling is shared. It's mutual across the Capitol. And it is really interesting to watch these huge bipartisan numbers in both the House and the Senate being unable to talk to each other across the Capitol as opposed to across the aisle. And this is an age-old problem. I mean, this goes back to Thomas Jefferson and the intent behind creating the Senate. He talked about the saucer that would cool the hot tea of the House. And so this was really built into the way things are supposed to be. And the way you deal with it is you put people in a room and you force them to look at each other and talk to each other and work through the bill. It's called a conference committee. I think that we are moving in that direction. I think that the Speaker and Chairman Hill on the House side have already said they want to have a conference. If the House appoints conferees, I can't imagine any world where the Senate says no. And then we put these people who we all know and like, Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren and French Hill and Mike Flood and Cleaver and Maxine Waters. We've all worked with these guys. And you put them in a room, I am completely confident that they will be able to work through the differences and figure out what makes sense. And I can tell you this, we are going to support whatever comes out of that room because getting this bill done is absolutely the most important thing. And correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I think when we do this, we're going to be much better positioned to do it again because we will have shown not just Housers, but really the whole Congress. Yeah, this old thing called regular order, that we used for 230 of the last 250 years. It works.
I couldn't agree more. And we'll be in the same place, that there's some really important things. And I hope, something for both sides. We certainly want to see the funding hold up. And one of the biggest areas for us, as you know, is home. That's been the biggest. We would support all the different parts of federal housing, but for creating new supply of housing, home is particularly important.
This is the home program that is a major funding source, just for people to know.
And one of the things I think is that in parts of both House and Senate is home reform, and the work that you did with us with Chairman Flood and Representative Cleaver, I think is really good, because it's not only do we need the money, but can we make the program actually easier to use so that it works better?
And you all use the program, right? I mean, tell me help us understand, why is this program hard to use? Because there are communities that actually sometimes have to send money back to HUD because they couldn't spend it because the logistics just became too difficult?
Well, I think, my observation is, and we don't get a ton of federal money, but when I watch it, a couple things are true. One is that when Congress, well-intended, they try to solve one problem and they throw a new regulation in, but they don't look at getting rid of the old regulation. So you end up with this lattice work of regulation that becomes really hard to actually manage. And then sometimes the local person at the county level, who's the HUD administrator, or the home person at the county level, doesn't know how to do it. So there's actually an education component as well. So then they default to doing what's the easiest, or they end up, as you said, sometimes not even being able to use the money at all, which is the worst of all. Sometimes on top of that, counties put their own rules on top, and then that makes it even more impossible. But a couple examples, and these are good things that can be taken too far. The environmental review process in the bill is a chance to streamline and speed that up. We're all for being environmentally sensitive, but it shouldn't become a barrier to ever getting a project approved.
Right.
And it's the timelines have gotten so stretched out, and sort of the bureaucratic side of that has gotten so hard. So I think there are examples that do have bipartisan support, which is, can we make it faster and easier to build? And then can we keep the support side? Because, and particularly as we've talked about, if we only keep putting money into the demand side and don't grow supply, we're just going to keep housing inflation driving up. We do need demand support for very low income families, but we've also got to make sure we're building more units, whether that's for rent or for entry level home ownership.
Yeah. One of the things that really impressed me was that Congressman Cleaver and Chairman Flood made a point of going out and saying, help us understand this program and why it doesn't work and what you need. And they talked to a lot of stakeholders and really went to the experts on what is good about the program and what's challenging, and wrote the bill around that, and then came back to us and said, did we get this right? A lot of thought went into this legislation, with an understanding that it's a complex set of issues and a complex program, and we need to simplify it without dumbing it down.
Totally agree. And I would say there's an opportunity on the USDA side with their rural housing, and we could do more on that side as well, because you've got some of the same dynamics that make it really challenging to actually implement. And we've certainly seen we've lost some of the people who know how to make the system work as well. And so at a personal level, I would have loved to see more of the energy on DOGE on actual reform as opposed to just the cutting staff, because leaving the structure and removing staff who know how to make the structure work is kind of the worst of all worlds potentially.
Yes, we certainly are in the midst of the worst of all worlds when it comes to that. And one of the things we're doing is, our AI work is preparing to help HUD write some of these regs without the people that have done it in the past, and coordinate and collaborate with all the different players who know how this works, so that they can have something to work off of that makes sense and not have to wait 2 years for a new reg. Tell me about the Homeownership Supply Accelerator. This is something that I know is near and dear to your heart. Help us understand, what is this concept and how do you see it really making a difference?
I'll be honest, this has to be phase 2. Phase 1 is we got to get the current road to housing and housing for the 21st century reconciled and passed, and signed. We need all 3 of those things to happen first. And let's be optimistic, assuming that happens, where we have been planting the seeds for now quite a few years is that one of the particular missing gaps are entry-level home ownership opportunities. And we've seen, I think the White House has probably overweighted the argument this is all about private equity. It's really about not building enough housing and the cost of that housing.
Yeah.
And we need to build more entry-level starter homes. And, we certainly don't think everyone should be a homeowner, but Habitat's particular niche, and we support from a policy perspective all of the housing spectrum, but our particular niche has been that access to home ownership. And if we think about a world of people with assets and without assets, historically, the one way to create an asset over time was through the long-term savings of owning a home. And so we believe we've got to create more starter homes.
And describe a starter home for me. What does that look like?
So historically, a starter home actually could look a lot like a Habitat home. If you go back to the 1950s, a starter home was a 3-bedroom, 1-bath home that a family on one income could afford on about 30% of their income. And what has happened in the last 6 years is now the square foot per person has gone up so much that actually a Habitat home today is pretty much what a middle-class home was in the 1950s, about 1,100 square feet, 3-bedroom home, and what the goal and challenge is, how do we get closer to that family being able to afford that home on about 30% of their income?
Right.
And it was always tough in California, New York, Hawaii. What's been brutal in the last 6 years is Atlanta, Dallas, Tampa, Nashville, Charlotte, all the places where, families were moving to because you could buy a home for $150,000.
Lincoln, Nebraska, and Boise, Idaho. I mean,
exactly.
You had an affordable housing crisis in Lincoln, Nebraska. You got an affordable housing crisis.
Exactly. And so those markets have doubled, and that's the shocker. And I think that does go back to the fact that we underbuilt. If we go back all the way to 2008, and I'm preaching to the expert here, but the big builders recapitalized and came back. A lot of small builders couldn't get recapitalized, didn't come back. We lost supply. That added up over the years. So you could, depending on whose math you use, we were underbuilding by a few 100,000 units a year for year after year after year. And then depending whose methodology, we're between 2 and 6 million units short. And of course, then COVID happens and demand goes up. Everybody wants more housing. All those young people who are living in apartments that people said never wanted to own homes, they actually really did want to own homes. They just had college debt and were delaying their family formation. And so demand went up, supply chains got disrupted, supply got even worse temporarily, and then we've been in catch-up mode. But all the inputs went in the wrong direction. So building materials went up, cost of financing went up after 0% for so long, skilled labor costs went up, and land went way up. And so the combination of that meant that, that $150,000 house in Atlanta is now a $300,000 house. That's a huge challenge. And you've got, without supply keeping up, people bidding up those houses. So we saw housing prices going up 15 to 20% per year in some markets. So even though now inflation is settled, it's not going back down to where we were before or anything close to it. And then insurance has jumped on top of that because of risk. So if you think about your housing cost as cost of your rent or mortgage plus your utility bill plus your insurance bill, your total cost of housing is painfully higher than it was 5 years ago.
And we definitely could have a whole conversation just on insurance, but we'll stick to construction and development. Coming back to the legislation that's in Congress now, what do you think are some of the most important things that it accomplishes? What are some of the provisions that you're really looking forward to? We mentioned home. Are there others?
I think the ones that will make the most difference, one is that the funding keeps up so that Congress is actually funding. For Habitat, there are a couple of tiny ones that are particularly important for us and a couple of other housing groups. So SHOP is a tiny program that's self-help home ownership, and that's tiny but very effective and important for Habitat specifically. There's a small Section 4 program that's very important to LISC Enterprise and Habitat that's more in-house, that's capacity building. But I think on the bigger side, it is making sure that we are sustaining the overall funding. And then I would say the reform sides of making it faster and easier to build. And maybe this is the place where I'm starting to see the most traction at the state and local level, and therefore hopefully receptivity at the federal level in terms of how do we get the incentives right to actually create more supply. Because I do think if you look at the places that historically have made it easier to build, they are in comparatively better shape. Now, they're still accelerating because of inbound migration. So Texas, if you compare it as Ezra Klein certainly did, Texas to California, we did our big Jimmy Carter build in Austin, and I think Austin is permitting housing at a rate, I think, what was the statistic? Austin permitted about as much housing as all of Southern California.
Yeah.
And so they are at least trying to catch up with their growth and making it as easy as possible. It's easier to point to the places that have made that. I do think philosophically, if Congress, the other part is how do you make it more of the carrot than the stick, but essentially creating incentives for state and local jurisdictions who get federal funds to make it faster and easier to build. And that's where I want to, connect the dots. And that can be viewed as overly coercive. But if you think more on the positive side, if you are, in fact, getting rid of unneeded and onerous regulations around parking, around minimum lot size, around other barriers, and then you'll have more access. I think transit is still interconnected. So we don't need density everywhere, but we need density where the transit exists so people have access to their jobs. I think if you look at cities historically, we created mixed income, mixed use cities by definition because everyone had to be able to get to work. But in the last 75 years, we've actually moved to more economically segregated cities, which is actually not good for social mobility, but also not good for quality of life. So I live in Atlanta, lots of heavy traffic. I live on the north side of Atlanta, which is a little bit the wealthier part of town. They did a traffic study and they looked at why is traffic so bad? Well, it turns out that 90% of the people who work in our part of town don't live in our part of town.
Yeah, go figure.
Well, what a concept.
Everybody you run into all day long, starting with the person who watches your kids in the morning to the person who's taking care of your parents to everybody who serves you any food, they all can't afford to live where we live. That's not right.
And so I think figuring out, and that goes back, so I still back to supply. So to your point, I think, and I didn't fully answer on the supply accelerator, the accelerator would be around giving basically capital, low-cost financing to nonprofit or for-profit developers who are creating entry-level housing. And so just be trying to stimulate the market, but stimulate on the supply side versus the demand side. And that's really, we would still support the demand side help. We think people are, their families, first-time home buyers who will need down payment assistance. We think we are for those things. But if we keep pushing money on the demand side and don't actually create the housing opportunities for those families, I fear those demand stimulation just create higher prices rather than actually creating more housing opportunities for those families. So the idea of the accelerator is really to be a catalyst at the federal level to support those local and state efforts for creating more supply of entry-level housing. And that could be townhomes, condos, or single-family homes. The form doesn't matter as much as the opportunity.
Right. This has been really interesting. I think we are at an inflection point. It is definitely a different environment than when we started talking about this 5 or 8 years ago. And getting this bill done, so important. And I am optimistic. I think we are going to get this bill done. I think everybody wants to do it. And we need to just help members of Congress and members of the Senate stay focused and optimistic about getting their work done.
Totally agree.
Yeah, it's totally doable. And I think we've suffered from a real failure of imagination and confidence that we can actually have a government that works and settled into this, well, it's just the way it is. And it's not the way it is. It's the way it has become and can definitely become something else just the same way.
Yeah, no, we could get into a whole conversation around the media and the reinforcement and the incentives. I do think the incentives at the retail level for politicians and the media are broken because they reward lack of cooperation and extreme positions. But I do find when I meet in person with members of the House and Senate, they want to get stuff done. They want to make lives better for the people in their districts. I'm amazed how local it is. You'll meet with a senator. They'll talk about the specific blocks and where the houses are going, which projects are going up, and it is they really care, and politics ultimately are local. But I do think we have a unique opportunity because the need is so great and a chance to show. The other thing I think we can do a better job of collectively is showing that if we invest in housing, it actually is going to reduce other costs. And there's really good data on this. I think when there were tests under the Obama administration of paying for results in hospitals as opposed to paying for procedures, the hospitals started looking at their most expensive cases and then figuring out how do you not just treat the symptoms, but treat the root cause. Turned out making the houses healthier, getting rid of mold, changing the conditions in the housing dramatically lowered the cost of healthcare. In a similar way, there's an interesting experiment a friend of mine was doing with Catholic charities, Catholic hospitals, and churches. And churches were providing land. Catholic hospitals were paying for supportive housing to get built. And Catholic charities was building and operating the housing because they found they would save so much in treating those residents in the emergency room or putting them in hospital beds at 10x or 20x cost per night versus putting them in. So I think one of our challenges is actually thinking across budgets as opposed to only. I remember being on a panel with the New Zealand health minister a number of years ago, and he said the most efficient health spending we could possibly do in New Zealand was to invest in weatherizing housing for the elderly. Because we would spend so much less on tuberculosis and pneumonia and respiratory illness if we made small modifications to make those homes warmer and safer for the people in them. And so home preservation is a whole thing we didn't talk about, but I think is certainly a need as well. But I do think if we can help people see the connections between housing and the health outcomes they want, housing and the educational outcomes they want, we know if children are in stable housing, they do dramatically better in school. And so then we're spending less on all the impacts of poorly educated children. So I do think the people are starting to see more of that. And the more we can tell that story, one of the things to that exact point that I'm excited about, and we just launched this week, is our Open the Door campaign. And this is rare for us, but a national marketing campaign in the US around how do we open the door for opportunity? And it is specifically, it's bringing creative artists from around the country who are literally painting doors, but then we're tying it with facts and action items so that we started in Manhattan and we're rolling across the country. But it's a chance for people to interact with and understand, hey, we need to open the door to housing so we can open the door to better health, to better education, to better job opportunities, to better livelihoods for the communities, and see that we can all benefit from that.
I like it. So I want to leave with my favorite question I ask all my guests, because I want people to feel like they left this experience getting to know you a little better. Tell me, what's the most interesting thing about Jonathan Reckford that has nothing to do with your work?
Maybe the most surprising, which makes me smile when I think about it, is after I left Wall Street before graduate school, I ended up moving to Korea and doing marketing work for the Seoul Olympics. And then more surprisingly, ended up coaching the Korean national rowing team and living in the training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes. And that was a life-changing experience on so many levels. But that's probably the most interesting part of my resume that doesn't get much attention.
Do you still row?
I don't, but I would love to. I don't have the time and space right now, but I hope to. I've been living vicariously. I have a niece who is a 2-time Olympian, and I've been cheering for her.
Wow. I love it. Awesome. That's great. That's very exciting. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you do and the opportunity we've had to work together and that our organizations have had to collaborate. And yeah, I feel like we're a couple of guys who just stumbled into our dream jobs, and it's pretty nice.
Well, Dave, thank you for your leadership. I love these conversations you've been having with others, and thank you for leading the charge in our diverse community at a time where it could not matter more. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.